everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of picking your Alaska cruise. There's a lot of things to consider when you're making this decision. When can you go? How long can you travel? Are you going to extend your experience with a land tour either before or after your cruise? Do you have any kind of brand loyalty to a particular cruise line for any reason? If you're thinking about extending your experience with a land tour either before or after, that kind of eliminates the idea of a round trip sailing, meaning departing from Seattle and then sailing up to Alaska and returning to Seattle or Vancouver, unless your trip is round trip from like Anchorage, Whittier, Seward. All of this to say, picking a cruise is a very personal decision. You know yourself and your budget and your time constraints better than I do. And you know how you like to vacation better than I do. So I can't tell you what the right cruise for you is going to be, but I'm hoping that today I will give you some things to consider that will help you make your decision about which cruise you want to take to Alaska. Let's start with when to travel. Outside of your own personal travel constraints, let's say your entire year is wide open, you want to go to Alaska, it's gonna depend very highly on what you want to see. If you want to see the Northern Lights, an Alaska cruise is not going to be your best bet. Your best bet is actually going to be to go in the wintertime, and there aren't very many, if any, cruise ships sailing to Alaska in the wintertime. Your best bet is going to be probably a land vacation, flying to Anchorage or even Fairbanks to get a better view in the wintertime, just because the dark is going to be when you're going to have a better opportunity to see those lights. But if you're set on an Alaska cruise, there are 3 sections of like the Alaska cruise season, and they call them like the early shoulder, the peak summer season, and then the late shoulder season. So we'll start with the early shoulder season. What you can see, this is April, May, as early as April going into May. And in the early shoulder season, you can see generally gray whale migration. I've not seen this, but I've always wanted to see the gray whale migration. And then you'll have like cooler weather. It could be rainier than in peak summer. Wildlife may or may not be less active during this season depending on how cool and how rainy it is. A lot of the wildlife activity you're going to see more in the like midsummer, like peak summer, and then the late shoulder season. So moving on to like the peak summer season, this is June, July, August. This is when you'll see most wildlife activity, bears and moose. You'll be able to see a lot of those. This is generally the driest season for southeast Alaska, and it could be rainy in like south central Alaska, think Anchorage area. This is also generally the warmest season to travel, is midsummer. And during this season or section of the Alaska sailing season, you will experience what's called the midnight sun. Even early shoulder and late shoulder, you'll have longer hours of daylight, but in the peak summer is when you'll experience midnight sun, meaning you will have daylight hours even almost up to midnight. Summer solstice is the longest day of the year, and that's true, for everybody in the northern hemisphere. So that is typically like June 21st, I think. So around those days is where you will have the most daylight hours, but leading up to that, the days will continue to get longer, and then, leading away from that, the days will get slowly just a little bit shorter. So it's not just one day that you'll have the midnight sun, it's the entire season, but you may have more, slightly more or slightly less daylight depending on when you sail. And for the late shoulder season, this is typically late August, September, and even early October if the cruise lines are still sailing in October. Some of the salmon tend to run a little bit later in the season, think July, August, September. So you may, if you're really wanting to see like the salmon run like at the highest peak of salmon run, you'll have a better viewing in the later bit of the summer season. It's also going to be a little bit darker during this season. You may have more ability for aurora borealis viewing during this season on a cruise. Maybe. It's potential. You can't guarantee that really anywhere, anytime. There is a forecast that you can look at, but I don't know how far out it goes. I will link that in the description box below. And the late shoulder season is typically cooler and typically rainier everywhere throughout the state. Now that we've discussed when you should travel, next we're going to discuss what your budget is, and this includes both money and time for your budget. If you've got a lower price point that you're looking at for a cruise line, you might want to consider Norwegian or Royal Caribbean cruise lines. A mid price point is going to hit you with Princess, Holland America, Disney Cruise Line. And for higher budget cruises, there are lots of luxury cruise lines that sail in Alaska. Seabourn, Viking, I think Cunard, and even Regent Seven Seas will sail in Alaska. While we're talking about money, I want you to consider not just the cruise part of the vacation, but consider all of the ports you're going to go to and consider the shore excursions you're going to want to do. Because if you have a very set budget for your vacation and you're thinking, this is the one and only time I'm ever going to go to Alaska and I want to do it all, maybe price out some of your shore excursions first before pricing out your cruise, or maybe try to get an idea of how much those shore excursions are going to be through your cruise line or through a third-party entity that you're going to book like on shore. But if you have an idea, you want to do all of these different shore excursions and you eat up a lot of your budget with those shore excursions, maybe, since it's a very port-heavy itinerary, because most Alaska cruises are very port-heavy itineraries, maybe the time you spend on the ship is not the most important thing for your vacation. So maybe instead of sailing with Princess or Disney, maybe you will consider cruising with Royal Caribbean or Norwegian Cruise Line, just because it's maybe a slightly less expensive cruise, which gives you more budget to work with for your shore excursions. I'm done talking about money now. We're going to talk about time. I think generally Alaska cruises are on the shorter side, they're about a week. And on the longer side, you can do, like, I think there are round trip cruises from San Francisco up to Alaska and back that are upwards of 3 weeks long. So if you are really into being on a cruise ship for a really long time and you've got a hefty budget and you've got a lot of PTO to use for work, maybe that's something you want to consider. But think about how long you want to be gone, and again, consider if you're going to do a land tour portion of a vacation before or after your Alaska cruise. Because I will say this, and this is a personal note. I've spent extensive time in Alaska on land. So I've explored a bit of the interior Alaska. I've been to Fairbanks, I've been to Valdez, I've done the highway loop from Fairbanks and all the way back around to Anchorage, and that's really cool. That's not something you're going to be able to see on a cruise. Meanwhile, the stuff you see on a cruise in Alaska is stuff you can't get to see from land, because you can't drive to Juneau from anywhere. You can't drive to Skagway from Juneau. I mean, it's really hard to see some of these places that are in Southeast Alaska that most cruise lines cruise to without either spending a lot of money to fly there and then maybe a lot of money to stay there for a couple of days. So I think if you're gonna try to get the whole Alaska experience, doing a land and sea tour is one of the best ways to do it. But it does take time and additional finances to do it that way. Moving on, we're going to talk about how you prefer to travel. And you don't have to tell me. I would love to know if you want to leave that in a comment, because I'm just curious how most people like to travel. But you know yourself the best. And if you've been on a vacation before, you have an idea of what you liked and what you didn't like. What you wanted to do. Did you enjoy that? Is there something that you wanted to do that you didn't get to do? Okay, so consider your personal preferences when you're selecting an itinerary. This includes ports, as well as a cruise line and a cruise ship. If you are, wanting to be constantly entertained, you're going to be constantly active, maybe consider a Royal Caribbean or Norwegian cruise ship. Disney even has a lot of onboard entertainment. Royal Caribbean and Norwegian tend to have more onboard amenities. Like Royal Caribbean and Norwegian are big for their slides and their zip lines on their ships and like the little lift things that take you up in the air. And these are well and good if that's the kind of stuff that you're into. If you're not into that, then, maybe that's not the cruise ship for you. It doesn't mean you can't have a good time on that cruise ship with those things. But I wouldn't suggest booking a cruise or a cruise ship for those amenities on board if you're not going to use them. If you prefer a more sedate pace, you just like looking out the window at the general splendor of Alaska, I get it. Princess or Holland America might be more your speed. There's still entertainment on board, but it's not going to be overwhelming. It's not going to bombard you with, activities that you feel like you're missing something every moment of the day. And it is a slow enough pace that it allows you to relax on your vacation, enjoy the environment you're in, and then still feel like you're getting a little bit of entertainment from the cruise ship. I will talk just a little bit about what makes some cruise lines special or unique. Starting with Princess and Holland America. These two cruise lines have been sailing Alaska the longest. I think Holland America has been sailing in Alaska at least 75 years, and Princess is just 1 year behind Holland America. They have priority access, I believe, to Glacier Bay. Some cruise lines I don't think get to sail into Glacier Bay at all. So if that is important to you, make sure that your cruise itinerary that you're picking takes you to Glacier Bay. Both of these cruise lines have a focus on nature and conservation. It's really important to these cruise lines that you understand the environmental impact of your cruise, but also the economic impact of your cruise to these areas that you're sailing. I have found Princess to be a relaxing, luxurious cruise experience. As I mentioned before, they may be lacking in adventure on board for more active cruise passengers. Something I found to be an absolute game changer in cruising was the Princess medallion technology. So if you are a tech geek, if you like, your experience to be very easy and very streamlined, the Princess medallion was a game changer. Disney Cruise Line offers a lot of onboard entertainment. It's great for families, lots of activities for people of all ages. They do a really good job taking care of kids. I think there's only one Disney ship sailing in Alaska, so itineraries may be a little bit more limited. Norwegian and Royal Caribbean, they have lots of ships, lots of itineraries with lots of shipboard features that may appeal to more active cruisers. Think rock climbing and bumper cars, those stories, tall slides that take you from the top of the ship all the way down. So if that's something that appeals to you, if you're brand loyal to any of these companies, of course that's going to make a difference to you. Next, let's talk about luxury cruise lines. I'm not going to name these by name. Most of these tend to be on smaller cruise ships, and they offer a much more intimate experience. I believe they offer like a slightly closer glacier viewing experience. The draft on these smaller ships tends to be less, so I think they can get a little bit closer to the glaciers. Many of them offer all-inclusive packages that may include onboard activities and even shore excursions in part of your cruise fare, as well as, like your beverages and food on board. The last thing I want you to consider are the ports of call, including, but not limited to, the embarkation port and the disembarkation port. If you've been to Alaska once and you've thought, well, I really enjoyed this port, but I didn't get to go here, maybe consider looking specifically for an itinerary that will take you to a port that you've never been to before. But as for the embarkation and disembarkation ports, this may or may not be a matter of significance to you. For some, it is an important consideration. Cruises northbound to Alaska may depart from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, or Vancouver. Cruises southbound from Alaska may depart from Anchorage, Seward, or Whittier. A lot of people are going to need to fly to their embarkation day port. And what that means for international travelers, a lot of times, especially, if you're not coming from the United States or Canada, is customs. And sometimes customs can be a little bit tricky. If US passengers are sailing from Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Seattle north to Alaska, they won't need to go through customs until they disembark the ship. If US passengers are flying from US to Vancouver to embark the ship in Vancouver, they'll have to go through customs at the airport before they get on their cruise ship, and then they'll have to go through customs again when they come home. Likewise, for Canadian citizens, if they're embarking a ship in Canada, they won't have to go through customs, when they embark a ship in Vancouver, but they will have to go through customs if they embark in Seattle, Los Angeles, or San Francisco. And of course, outside of all of this, customs discussion is travel time, available flights, cost of flights. It may be relevant to your budget considerations. Sometimes flights to Alaska can be expensive. Personally, I have found Alaska Airlines to be marvelous. They've got good prices, wonderful seats, and fantastic service. I usually generally fly on Southwest, and I have found the service to be comparable between Alaska and Southwest. I really enjoy flying with Alaska, and I fly Alaska when I can, even if I'm not going to Alaska. If I can't get a flight that I like on Southwest, I will fly Alaska. In the end, the selection process is unique to every situation. If you've been to Alaska on an Alaska cruise before and you're planning to go again, your cruise may not be the same, your situation may not be the same. So every travel situation is unique, and you should treat it as such. Keep in mind your financial budget, your time constraints, and your travel preferences, and go from there. I would suggest that if you watch YouTube videos, vlog series, of people going on Alaska cruises, take it with a grain of salt. Experiences can be very personal, and yours may be very similar or different. Everybody's got personal preferences and different opinions and different ways of expressing those opinions. There's often very helpful information shared in those videos, but sometimes it can be buried beneath sponsorships, personal preferences, and even prejudice. One last thing I want to mention before I leave you today: Alaska is a bucket list destination for travelers worldwide. You will want to book your Alaska cruise as early as possible. I'm filming this in January of 2025. You may or may not be able to find a berth on a cruise to Alaska this summer. Maybe. Your prices for next summer may be better. Your options for, different staterooms may be better if you're booking for 2026 instead of 2025, just because it often helps to book earlier in advance. Thanks again for hanging out with me today. If you've got any tips or suggestions, please share those in the comments. I won't pretend that this video is the end-all be-all, but I do hope you found it helpful. So I'm going to say goodbye for now. You guys will see me in another video really soon. Bye!